Jennifer Carroll McNeil, and you 15 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Maloney and your colleagues for coming in. So as I understand it then, you set the code for this environments process, you set the code in relation to it. Okay. And last year we spent €74 billion and €1 billion of that essentially was reallocated through this environments process. Is that correct?
Yes, Deputy, that's correct, yeah.
Sorry, could I
Please.
just interject there? It's $1 billion in these 4 cases. There were other environments as well, so the total amount that moved would probably be substantially more.
What would be the total amount?
I don't know that
I
there would
don't
be an
have that
aggregation.
figure with me, Deputy. I can get
Is
it for you. But
3 billion, 5 billion, 10 billion? Is it, you know?
No, I think that the instances that the Controller has highlighted in his report account for the main large-scale transfers.
So
there are day-to-day smaller transfers involved as well.
Okay, so it's at least 1 billion then, out of 74.
Yeah.
Okay, grant. And you're saying that the code, that you've stepped outside the code essentially because of COVID. You needed to move money quickly. Is that it, in essence?
No, Deputy. What we're saying is that public financial procedures sets out guidelines that give the Department, considerable flexibility in how it approaches environment. There were particular circumstances in 2020 and 2021 related to COVID that impacted in 3 ways. Firstly, the closures impacted on capital spend. Secondly, the government took decisions in relation to supporting businesses and households directly related to COVID. But more importantly, maybe most importantly from the point of view of environment, a lot of ordinary day-to-day services spent less money because people couldn't access those services because of COVID.
Sure, exactly. So because of COVID, you use this procedure more than you would normally use it. Is that correct?
I think that is fair to say, yeah.
All right, that's what I said. So what did you do then when you were going through this process? How did you flag it? How are you going to, for example, is it going to happen this year?
So we would expect it to happen much less this year. The COVID-related restrictions and the unpredictable elements of COVID were much smaller this year than they were in either 20 or 21. We are working to get back to a more normal situation post-COVID. So in essence, normally what happens is we don't really support environment in ordinary circumstances because savings are often time-related savings. You haven't hired people in time. Yeah. You know, they're costs that will carry on to the next year. So really reallocating those costs this year is no good because you've then spent it and you need it again next year when you have managed to hire people. In COVID, it was slightly different because although the savings are themselves temporary related to the closures related to COVID, so were the COVID supports that they were then used to support. So from our point of view, the context to environment in 20 and 21 was very different to other years. And one of the things that we strove to do was to make sure that we didn't, have $1 billion worth of extra money kind of from the Oireachtas that wasn't required. And in fact, because of the unpredictability of COVID and because of the unpredictable events as it rolled out through the year, we ended up, even with considerable environment of existing allocations, with a very large surrender to the Exchequer at the end of the year.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, can I ask you then, just I'll come back to that, but I just want to ask you then about the management of capital funds generally. Say, for example, with some of the bigger spending departments, the bigger spending cap, because ultimately you are responsible for the delivery of the NDP and the major capital projects. The funding is coming through you, the overall supervision is coming from you, correct?
The departments are responsible for the delivery of capital projects. We maintain an oversight and supervisory role, yes.
Public expenditure and reform, exactly. So let's say, for example, in 2022, because obviously 2021 was a bit different, what do you expect, say, for example, with the Department of Housing? Where are they on profile at this stage, 3/4 of the way through the year, in terms of their capital spend? So in percentage and monetary terms.
So get those numbers for you, Deputy. But in broad terms, this year has seen considerable supply chain disruption at the start of the year related to the war in Ukraine, considerable uncertainty caused by inflationary developments at the start of the year, and that has impacted on decisions of people and developers and so on and so forth.
Are you talking in the private sector or are you talking in the Department of Housing?
In the industry as a whole, in the construction industry as a whole.
But what I'm asking is the Department of Housing, specifically within my 15 minutes, the Department of Housing spend relative to where they should be on capital projects.
So the exact number is 452 million, or 30% below profile.
They're 30% below profile, 3/4 into the year.
Profile.
And when did you, where were they at, say, at the end of Q1 relative to profile?
I would imagine, Deputy, that I don't have that number to hand. I only have the most recent number, but I can get you that. I imagine they were still below profile at the end of Q1. I mean, I think a lot of the problems were in Q1.
Okay, because and what do you expect will be the situation by the end of Q4?
We don't have complete sight of that, Deputy, because during the year, the nature of capital is, as I'm sure the committee knows, the nature of capital is that it's often back-ended, particularly around housing. So
that's one of
we're-
my concerns, actually, Mr. Maloney. I'm glad you've raised that, because one of my concerns is that it is being spent at the end of the year in a sort of a heavy way. On a range of different projects, including the purchase of turnkeys, which the department will say help finance the development of those properties, which is fine, except that there's a willing market out there already to purchase homes. And what I'm interested in is your department's oversight of the capital spend relative to profile and your capacity to do that. It's my understanding that you do have that oversight role and you do have somebody liaising with the Department of Housing in relation to their capital spend, do you not?
That's absolutely correct, Deputy. We do have the oversight role. It is the Department of Housing that make decisions in how to achieve their capital
so
objectives, but we do have that oversight role.
What I'm curious about is because from the overall perspective of the state to deliver capital projects, it does require an oversight mechanism such as yourself. What's your capacity or your department's capacity to test how the Department of Housing is doing relative to profile and in terms of its decision making? For example, do you have any engineers, chartered surveyors, any people with professional expertise in the industry, or is it somebody else who's supervising it?
So in the first
and not just with
instance,
housing, say for example with transport as well, because it occurs to me that it should be like if you're to properly manage, if your objective is to make sure that the capital projects are delivered on behalf of the state, you've provided the funding in relation to that in order to be able to effectively oversee that delivery, that you need to at least have the capacity to test what the departments are saying to you in terms of the delivery of the projects. And that it seems to me that a key part of that is the capacity to test it technically as much as from an accounting perspective.
So Deputy, our key role is financial monitoring and oversight and value for money. So we don't have any of that technical expertise, whether it be in school building, transport or roads. I mean, that expertise rests with the department who are responsible for developing and delivering on the projects.
So how can you, but I don't think that's enough. I don't think it's enough to give a big pile of money to the Department of Housing, Department of Transport, and to fail to have an oversight mechanism for the state to ensure that they're actually being tested externally in some way to make sure those projects are delivered. Because the sense that you have is that there's an awful lot of money in the state, but things aren't happening, they're not getting delivered. I'll give you a different example. With the local authorities, for example, which is a source of continual frustration in this room, that the CNAG isn't able to audit their accounts. They received, was it €5.8 billion funding in the last year, and we have no capacity to test how that's being spent in relation to the delivery of capital projects, whatever about the management of HAP or anything else but the capital projects, except for them essentially auditing themselves, and the CNAG can only go so far. So what my question is, really, is about your department's capacity as the ultimate overseer on behalf of the state to technically and expertly probe the management of different projects without having to resort to your KPMGs or your Deloittes or anything else. Do you just give them money and wait for them to come back at the end of the year with they either have a return or they don't have a return? Whatever, how can you be sure that the projects are actually being delivered, A, delivered efficiently, B, delivered with the best value for money, C, and that whatever needs to be learned, because there's always something to be learned in any engineering project, is being captured by the state system for the following capital projects? Where's your expertise in relation to that? Or do you just pass on the money?
So Deputy, the role of my department is the financial monitoring and oversight and value for money. In terms of oversight of the delivery of the actual projects, that is the responsibility of the department. That is audited by the CNAG, and appropriation accounts are presented to the Public Accounts Committee in the Dáil.
Isn't the OPW part of your department?
The OPW is part of the Minister's responsibilities, yes.
Right, and so they have significant capital projects. For example, aren't they engaged in a project in relation to modular housing at the moment? Isn't that supposed to start shortly?
The OPW have their own accounting officer, as you know, Deputy. They are engaged, as far as I know, in procuring modular housing in respect of accommodation for Ukraine.
Do you know when that's going to start?
I don't have visibility on that. That is a matter for the accounting officer in the OPW, but I think it's quite shortly.
Yeah, it's quite shortly. I think they're given that responsibility in May. It's now October. And I mean, I understand the OPW may have rectified it, the absence of qualified, because this came up at this meeting before, engineers, chartered surveyors and so on, that it obviously needs a measure of technical expertise to be able to manage projects and so on. But that's in respect of itself. And what my suggestion to you is that you also need it, like we have raised in relation to the accounts, and I know you've mentioned it in your opening statement that you've now including legal costs and so on, but we still regard that as insufficient, having regard to your own code of practice for what needs to be included in the accounts of state bodies, and indeed from a legislative perspective what we've said private bodies need to do. It should be in the appropriation accounts. There should be information in relation to temporary agency staffing. It should crucially, obviously, gender, but let's go to what I'm talking about, which is expertise, and who's there in terms of expertise in the state, on behalf of the state, so that we're not having to outsource every thought to KPMG, because we're more than well able to do it ourselves. But my suggestion is, in order to be able to properly oversee the delivery of projects for which the taxpayer is funding, the Oireachtas has voted money towards, that it is your responsibility to make sure that they're delivered, and that you need a measure of technical expertise to be able to probe the delivery of those different projects.
So I think that is really the point, Deputy, that our responsibilities relate to the financial management and value for money oversight of the projects, that the people responsible for the overseeing the technical aspects and the people with the sectoral expertise are the departments who are responsible for delivering.
And do you think that's the right structure?
That's the structure as set out in legislation.
Okay, yeah, I can't ask you a policy question, but I mean, would you have any desire to see a stronger oversight role? For example, are you satisfied that all the projects that you're funding are being delivered efficiently and correctly?
So we have a number of ways, including through the spending review process of testing that. We demand business cases in relation to the projects. We look at those. We have a major projects advisory group for very large projects. So we have means of assessing those. But again, we don't have engineering or technical expertise, and I don't think that us duplicating that type of expertise. You mentioned the OPW quite rightly, but the OPW delivers projects and therefore has architects, etc.
No, I accept that. I'm not suggesting that you get into project delivery, but I am suggesting that when you're testing, for example, with the Department of Housing, how they're doing in terms of the delivery of it, that you have somebody who can actually ask probing questions in relation to the delivery of different projects. The Department of Housing, you give me the example, is now 30% under profile at this 3/4 stage of the year. Were that trajectory to continue, you would say that it would be 40% under profile for the end of the year. Now, we both know that's not going to happen. They're going to spend like Billio at the end of the year. But is that, what are they going to spend that on? Are you sitting down and asking that question now? For example, if they're going to sit down and spend that on turnkey developments all over the country, is that actually what the government intended them to do? Or had they intended them to deliver housing in a different way, in a sustained way throughout the year? Is that a satisfactory way of managing that, is my question.
So just to be clear, Deputy, I mean, we're in constant, the vote team in DEPA is in constant touch with the Department of Agriculture, there's constant Department of Housing, and other departments. Constant communication. We at all stages have a fairly good oversight of how much money is being spent and where it has been spent, and we grant sanction for that. So there's an ongoing and quite detailed conversation. So we do have visibility on where the money is going, if that's the question. And that is what we focus on.
I appreciate that. So you have visibility on where the money is going, but it doesn't sound like there's a conversation about whether that's enough, whether it's correct. Is that going to deliver at the end of the year? If you have constant visibility, for example, at what stage do you go to the point where is 30% an acceptable under profile? Are there other departments under profile at 30%? Or which departments, for example, are over profile at this point in the year? Because this is an important year from an inflationary management perspective. You want to spend capital, you want to spend the capital that's there for a whole range of different reasons. So which departments are over profile at this point?
So to my knowledge, Deputy, there's really only one department significantly over profile, and that's the Department of Education. Departments have faced significant challenges this year and last year indeed, because firstly COVID and then Ukraine, supply chain disruption related to Ukraine. So there have been considerable challenges in particularly rolling out new programmes, and as you know, the National Development Plan represents considerable uplift in our capital ambitions. So there is a certain amount of catch up in the face of COVID, in the face of supply chain disruption, and indeed, as you say, in the face of inflation.
I accept COVID, but that ended last year. There's been no sites closed this year, and indeed there's an opportunity for a huge catch up on what had been there before.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's...
Well, sorry, there's the two aspects. One is the supply chain disruption and COVID. The other is the significant increase in capital funding.
So can I ask you then,
so
just
the spend is
on the
actually
profile.
13.4% ahead. of last year.
But
But it's
last year
below
was an
profile
anomaly year.
because
Last
there's
year
been
doesn't
a-
count because it was COVID year, as you say, there was all sorts of things closed, you've said it yourself. What I'm interested in is this year. So housing is 30% below profile, education is ahead, where's transport?
Transport is 150 million, which is 13.1% below profile.
So is housing at 30%, is that the biggest below profile, or is there somewhere bigger?
Oh, yeah,
That's the biggest?
I think it probably is the biggest.
Okay, what's the next biggest there, Miss Callaghan? I see you have the list.
The Department of Environment, Climate and Communications at 14.4%.
14. So environment is at 14 under profile. Which did you say was at 13 under profile? Forgive me. You just said it a minute ago.
Department of Transport.
Transport was 13 and housing is 30%. That's a considerable gap under profile. And you're not testing how they're spending. You're not sitting down with an engineer and going, what are the projects, what's behind, what's not getting delivered? And then at the end of the year, like happens at the end of every year in housing, it'll get caught up somehow, because last year in 2021, I appreciate it was a COVID year, but the money nearly all got spent. It was what, 116 million surrendered, which is a very small proportion of the 5.1 billion that they had, because it all gets spent at the end of the year. There's a rush to spend it. Now, my contention is that that's not a sufficient, that's not an acceptable way or to manage it within the Department of Housing itself, but is for you as an overseer of that either. And I think that you need to strengthen your expertise to be able to ask
Deputy.
more probing questions.
Thank you. Deputy Verona Murphy, 10 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, everybody.